Hi everyone, Gail Doane here. Welcome into my sewing space. This is another in our series of short instructional videos. This is not a technique video. This one is going to be a discussion on different pleated fabric samples. I've pleated up a whole stack of things here. If you're fairly new to smocking or pleating, this might be a helpful resource to get an idea of how some fabrics behave when they are pleated. So this is by no means a comprehensive list, but it's a quick look at what some fabrics are going to do. So right from the start, this is a piece of 45-inch wide fabric. It's called Milana, which is one of the really fine Swiss batistes. And you can see that it pleats down really small. If I was using this on a real project, I would have put a strip of lightweight fusible interfacing behind it, which would have helped fill out those pleats. As is, this pleats down to about a 6-to-1 pleating ratio. So for every 1 inch of space you need to cover, you need 6 inches of fabric to pleat down, which would be a really high ratio. 3 to 4 is more normal. So that's what a piece of Milana looks like, pleated with no interfacing on it. Moving to the opposite end of the scale on a piece of cotton. This is a piece of Kona Cotton, also 45 inches in width, but you can certainly get a sense of how different, even with those pleats pushed out a bit, there's just a lot more thickness to this. This wouldn't need interfacing on the back side of it. And I calculated the Kona Cotton to come out to about a 4-to-1 pleating ratio. And this would be the same weight as most quilting cottons. So that gives you an idea. If you're trying to fill up 10 inches of space, you would need at least 40 to 45 inches of fabric to pleat in to fill that up. A common fabric to use for smocking is Imperial Battiste, but again, I find it pretty lightweight if I don't put something in behind it. This is the same piece of fabric without interfacing. This piece has a piece of baby interfacing fused in behind, and then the fabric's pleated. And I would find this much easier to smock on with the thicker, more rolling pleats than these little knife pleats that I got on the uninterfaced piece. So again, Imperial Battiste, it's a nice poly cotton blend, doesn't wrinkle very much. One of my more favorite fabrics to smock on would be Liberty of London. They're Tana lawn. But like the Milana, it pleats down very small. It's generally 54 to 56 inches wide, and it will pleat down to something about this wide if you scrunch those pleats right together. So in all instances on the Liberty, I would put a piece of baby interfacing behind it on a yoke style dress. Not so much on a bishop, but on a yoke style dress. It will make your pleats block out much nicer if you put the interfacing in place on the Liberty Tana lawn. Another favorite fabric for me to smock on is dotted Swiss. There's a couple of different samples. And again, if you look closely, this piece I have put interfacing in. This piece I have not. And you can see the difference in the weight or the thickness of the pleats. This would be much easier to smock on than the piece that doesn't have the interfacing behind it. And if you look closely, you may have noticed that I picked the dots out in the section that I'm going to smock. And it gives you this nice clean palette to smock on, and then it breaks open into where your dots are in place. And that's a really pretty look on a dress. Here's a couple of dress samples. done up that way. This one's all white on white, so it doesn't really jump out at you, but you can see all the tufts or the dots in the fabric, and then I've picked the dots out up here in the part where I was going to smock. It's much more obvious on one that has a color component to it. Colored dots here would have been all through this section here, but again, they've been picked out. The interfacing's been fused to the back side, and then the whole piece was pleated, and it gave me this nice clean palette to smock on. If you're working with a plaid of any kind, an even tartan plaid, it's a nice idea to smock on the tartan line as opposed to following your thread line. It doesn't feel so jumbled. And an example of that would be a dress like this, where I completely ignored where my thread lines were, and I just smocked along the green tartan lines with cable stitches and a little bit of trellis. And that's a really nice look on a traditional tartan. And most of this one has a wool component to it, so it was thick enough I didn't put interfacing on the back side of it. If you're working with a larger scale print, you can sometimes get an unpleasant surprise once you've pleated the fabric up, and this would be a really good example of that. When you just look at this fabric laid out, it just feels like this random all over sunflower print. But as soon as I pleated this, I got this really awkward diagonal thing happening, and that would be very distracting to smock over, unless you were smocking something really dense that almost filled this space in. I don't think this is a very appropriate choice of a fabric to smock on. And like I say, you sometimes get a surprise when you pleat things like this. The other fabric you can get a not very happy surprise with is some of the 1/16 or the 1/8 inch czech ginghams, the woven ginghams. And when this is run through the pleater, you tend to get this moire effect. I think if you're a spectacularly good pleater operator and are willing to go one tick at a time, you can possibly avoid this. I have never had good success using a pleater to pleat a 1/16 inch micro check without getting that effect. But that being said, if you are doing a design, this is the exact same fabric as this, and it looked dreadful when I pleated it, because the darker the color, the worse the moire look is going to be. But I elected to do a smocking design that was so dense that it completely took your eye off of this look, because that is not a good look on a smocked dress. You want to avoid that if possible. Featherweight corduroy is an interesting choice to smock on, but I don't really love the look of it when it's pleated, because again, you tend to get a little bit of that moire effect, and it where the pile falls one way and the other, I just don't love the look of it. So I tend to not use featherweight for a project that's going to be smocked and then it releases. What you can do though with a piece of corduroy, if you're doing an inset on a garment, is to flip it over and use the back side of the corduroy to smock your inset. And then that becomes the front of the project once it's smocked. And because it's dyed to the same color as the rest of the corduroy, you get this really good color match. So I think limited use for me for this kind of fabric. And also it pleats up very thick. It's probably a 3-to-1 pleating ratio. So you would need to make some adjustments if you were going to use that. Cotton piqué is a nice choice to smock on. And again, I'm not sure the camera will totally pick up on this, but generally on the fine line piqué, the ribs run vertically, like the selvage would be here and the ribs run up and down. This is what a piece looks like that was pleated correctly with the lengthwise grain going up and down, and you get sort of that same effect that you get with the corduroy. Because of the rib, you get this kind of uneven look up here in the pleated section. An interesting thing that you can do with fine line piqué is turn it completely sideways. So my lengthwise grain has been turned to go on the cross grain, and I like the look of the pleats a lot better when it's turned cross grain. So that's just something to think about on a piece of piqué. Sildubioni can be a real nightmare to pleat. If you just run a piece, because it's got all these slub lines in it, and this would be the definition of a pleating nightmare right here. This is run through the pleater without any interfacing on the back side and without any intervention on my part. I just cranked it through and it came off and it looked like that. This is unusable. Like, you could not even begin to smock on this. So there's a couple of things you can do with dupioni to solve that problem. This is the exact same piece of fabric as this, and it's also on the correct grain. The slubs are going selvage to selvage. But on this piece, I fused in a piece of baby interfacing on the wrong side. And as those pleats were coming off the needles, I would let the needles stack completely full of pleats, take my steam iron and steam them while they're actually on the needles, which sets those pleats into place, crank off, pull them off the needle, crank off another section that fills up the needles, steam those. It's a bit of a tedious process, but you can see there is a huge difference between what this sample looks like and what this sample looks like. This one you could use, this one you couldn't use. Here's a sample of a dress, very similar fabric, a few less slubs in it, smocked. There would be baby interfacing in behind my smocked section here, and I didn't have any trouble with my pleats going in all different directions on that. The other thing you can do with silk dupioni is turn it so the slub lines are going vertically, which means you've turned the grain of your fabric. You've got your cross grain going up and down, and that's got no interfacing on it, and it came off the needles pretty manageably because you're not fighting the slub line on it. But you would have to decide if you're comfortable turning. You would have to turn every one of your pattern pieces onto the cross grain rather than the lengthwise grain of the fabric. Rayon can be another fabric that has a real mind of its own and is not that conducive to pleating. This is a 100% rayon sample. Why I like rayon, though, is it has this beautiful drape to it, and it almost gives the feel of a lightweight wool. So here's a sample of a piece just cranked right through the pleater. Again, complete nightmare here. No amount of fiddling is going to save this. You could not smock on this piece. This is the exact same piece of fabric run through the same pleater, but I let it stack up on the needles, steamed it on the needle, rolled a little bit more off, steamed it again on the needle, and it came off in this very manageable fashion. And again, the drape on rayon is beautiful on a smock dress. I actually just pleated this piece in the last week. This is a new fabric for me. It's maybe been around a long time. It's called Brussels Washer. and it is a blend of rayon and linen. And I'm actually quite excited to smock this. I did have to steam the pleats on the needles as I was pleating this, but I'm completely happy with my pleated section. No interfacing on this. It's thick enough that those pleats held very nicely on their own. I didn't bring my sample in, but I'll pull up the dress. If you're going to double pleat something where you've got a sheer layer over top of some kind of an under layer, get my hand in there, a sheer under layer, so I've got an upper and an under. I would have rolled my two fabrics onto two separate dowels and held onto two dowels as it fed through the pleater, because they don't feed evenly. You can't stack them and roll them on the same dowel. You'll end up with a big bubble at the end. But you want to just be sure that both of your fabrics are nice and lightweight. That gives a really pretty look with the silk. This is silk organza over barissima. And it's a lovely combination of fabrics pleated together. I use quite a lot of wool, and again, it can be a big pain to pleat. This is a piece of not super lightweight, but if we were talking a scale of 1 to 10 on wool, this would be about a 3 or a 4. That's run through the pleater with no intervention on my part at all. And here's the exact same piece of fabric run through the pleater. Again, let those needles fill up with pleats, steam it on the pleat, and just keep repeating that process over and over again till you get, and the wool has this beautiful memory to it that those pleats just stay in that beautiful rolled position. That was the same fabric that I used to make this coat, and although it was quite bulky through this smock section here, those pleats were very manageable to work on. So I hope this is giving you a little bit of inspiration and a little bit of motivation to maybe pull out a piece of fabric and pleat it up and start a smocking project. Thanks so much for watching. Keep stitching.